So this is the final part of the Fungi and Plants lecture. We're going to talk about Kingdom Plantae, which covers almost about 300,000 different species of plants. And so we're going to start by talking a little bit about the characteristic of plants and then what make them different from fungi, and we'll start to distinguish them as a new kingdom evolutionarily. And so while they are eukaryotic, just like fungi, and multicellular, just like most fungi, they also have this interesting characteristic known as indeterminate growth. And so plants can actually grow for as long as they are alive. And so what you can see here on the right is a picture of the California redwoods. And as long as these trees are alive, they will continue growing. They never reach like a final growth state. This is a little bit different from animals, particularly humans, which achieve kind of a final growth point and don't just keep growing throughout their lifetime. Plants are also able to make their own food using photosynthesis. They're phototrophic, right? So they get their energy from light. And like fungi, plant cells have cell walls for extra protection and to provide some structure and prevent loss of water. But the makeup of their cell walls is slightly different from that of fungi. Their cell walls are made of a carbohydrate called cellulose. And cellulose is actually, if you've ever eaten a piece of celery, kind of those stringy fibers that you get when you bite into the celery. That is what cellulose looks like, kind of on a macro scale. But it is there for one of these important functions to prevent water loss, because plants, at least most of them, have been adapted to live on land. And so there are two major groups of land plants. There are non-vascular plants and vascular plants. And the difference between these two is whether or not they have a vascular network, or basically a network of tubes that are designed to conduct water and solutes and other nutrients throughout the organism. So the non-vascular plants do not have this vascular network to transport water, whereas vascular plants do. And then vascular plants are even further divided into plants that have seeds and plants that do not. And then the seed plants, as you can see here, are divided even further into two different types of seed plants. And we'll get more into all of these different categories as we move through the lecture. And so first, it's important to think about how plants had to adapt to living on land. And so moving to land was an advantage for plants because it gave them more access to better quality sunlight. And sunlight is how they ultimately make their food, and so it led to better nutrition. And in addition to more food, there was also less predators on land for plants. And so plants wanted to be able to move to land, but there were some kind of drawbacks that held them kind of back from being able to colonize land in the way that they wanted to. And one is that there's a lot less water on land, and so there's an increased chance of desiccation or drying out. It's also harder for plants to transport their eggs and sperm or their sex cells or gametes on land than it is through the water. And in addition, once those eggs and sperm are put together to form an embryo or a zygote, those zygotes don't have as much protection on land as they do in water, particularly from drying out. And so there are some adaptations that all plants have made to move towards land. And so to deal with this idea of kind of a lack of water, plants originally just kind of lived closer to water and lived in more humid environments. But as the space next to water got taken up by specific plants, they had to expand into drier areas. And one way that they were able to do this is by increasing their tolerance to drought or drying out. And one way that plants have evolved to do that is by minimizing water loss with this waxy cuticle on the outside of their leaves and stems. And so you can see that water beading up on the top of this leaf. In the same way that water beads up on top of the leaves and can't get in, it also cannot get out. And so this waxy cuticle helps protect plants and allow them to keep the water that they have inside and gives them a lower chance of drying out. And in addition, there's a special structure in the roots of plants that evolved to help them find water deep within the soil. And that's known as the meristem. And so you can see it here in this GIF dividing in blue. And it's basically just a bunch of cells at the very tip of a root that divide really rapidly. And as they divide, they push that root really deep into the ground. And it's really makes them very successful at finding water buried in the soil that might be far below the surface. And so the vascular plants, or the plants that have those kind of transport systems for water and solutes, make up 90% of the vegetation that we see on Earth. And that's because that vasculature made them very successful at living on land. And one of those adaptations that vascular plants have, in addition to waxy cuticles and the meristem that helps them find water, is a way to transport water and minerals as well as sugars. And so you can see here on Earth, this is an image of a plant stem. It's a cross section, so you've sliced the stem in half, and then you've turned it so that it's facing toward the top of it was facing towards you. And within that stem, there are two sort of tissues for transport. There's xylem, which is here in the dark green, that transports water and minerals, and phloem, which can be seen here in this kind of olive green, which transports sugars. And you can think of the vasculature as sort of the arteries and veins of the plant. And these two different tissues transport two different things throughout the body or the stem of the plant. And in addition to just having these tissues for transport, the root systems of vascular plants evolved to be quite large so that they could maximize absorption of water and nutrients from the soil. And their leaves evolved to be really broad so that they could maximize their absorption of sun. And if plants make their food from sun, then bigger leaves means more sun absorption, means more chance of making more food. And this allowed them to be pretty successful on the earth. And so those other two kind of disadvantages for plants to live on land were that the idea that their embryos are no longer protected or that their zygotes are no longer safe. And plants evolved seeds to stop that from happening. And then they solved that issue of it being hard to transport their sex cells or gametes by making kind of these sweet and nutritious molecules that would attract animals and help them spread their gametes or seeds without having to move themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about more of these in a little bit. And so within the category of the vascular plants are your seed plants, and they can be split into two categories: gymnosperms, or the naked seed plants, and angiosperms, which we'll talk about in a second. And so gymnosperms, as I said, means naked seed, and some gymnosperms that you might be familiar with are the conifers, like pine trees and spruce trees, things that have cones in order to spread their seeds. They have separate male and female sex cells or gametes, and they're pollinated mostly by the wind. And so those sex cells or gametes are inside of the cone, and the cone opens up, and wind can actually flow through it and allow pollination to occur and those plants to reproduce. But you can imagine that relying on the wind to do your bidding for you is not really the best idea, because sometimes there's a lot of wind and sometimes there's not as much. And so your seeds can't spread quite as far if you're relying kind of on the chance that wind will happen to pollinate you. And so the gymnosperms were nowhere near as successful as the angiosperms, or what are known as the flowering plants. And so when you think of a plant, you're most likely thinking of an angiosperm. So all flowers, grasses, crops like corn and apples are, as well as all deciduous trees like maple trees and oak trees, are all members of this angiosperm group. They're so successful and able to diversify so much and take over so much of the land because they evolved two different things: flowers and fruit. And those helped improve their reproductive success by giving the angiosperms a way to disperse their pollen and seeds more effectively. And so flowers have bright colors, and they can attract animals and other pollinators to them. And then the fruit is that kind of sweet, nutritious metabolite that also will attract animals. The seeds within, once those fruits have been eaten, can be spread by the animals as